The town wanted to drive the Apache woman out. The cowboys stepped in and said, "Whoever throws her, the dusty town of Red Mesa, sat like a forgotten relic on the edge of the universe." A frontier world far from the busy spaceports and cities of the United Earth, it was a place where the rules were written in the sand and enforced by whoever held the fastest gun or the loudest voice. Out here, people made their own way, and they didn't take kindly to outsiders. Taya, the Apache woman, had come to Red Mesa under strange circumstances. Some said she had walked into town from the vast desert that stretched endlessly around the settlement, as if she had been born from the very dust that covered the land. Others whispered she had some connection to an ancient alien race, that she carried with her secrets of the past that could change the future. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. Taya was different, and in Red Mesa, that was enough to make her an enemy. The townspeople had never trusted her. She was a woman of few words, dressed in the traditional clothes of her people, with a spirit that seemed as wild as the land she came from. At first they had watched her from a distance, curious but cautious. But when she started helping the sick and the injured, offering wisdom that no one expected from the stranger, the murmurs of suspicion grew louder. They didn't like how she made them feel, like their little corner of the universe wasn't as safe as they thought. Sheriff Tom Walker, a man with a hardened face and a heart that had seen too much, had tried to keep the peace. He wasn't sure what to think about Taya, but he knew that stirring up trouble in Red Mesa was a dangerous game. The town was already teetering on the edge, and he didn't need more problems. He had visited her hut once, just to see for himself. It was simple, tucked away on the outskirts of town where the desert seemed to swallow everything whole. Taya had welcomed him without fear, offering him tea, as if there was nothing unusual about an armed sheriff stepping into her home. They talked for hours about the stars, the old ways, and the struggles of survival in this harsh land. But when Sheriff Walker had left, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The people of Red Mesa weren't the type to welcome strangers with open arms, especially not one who carried the weight of the past like Taya. The question was, what was she really after? The tension between Taya and the townspeople finally reached a breaking point when old man Ralph Turner, the town's most vocal leader, took it upon himself to rally the residents. Ralph had been a miner in his younger days, and his hands still bore the scars of the deep tunnels he had dug. Now, he saw his chance to do something more than just complain about the state of things. He wanted to be a man of action. "We can't have her here," Ralph had declared one night at the town meeting. "She's dangerous, and we all know it. She's got no place in Red Mesa. We're not about to let some Apache woman stir up trouble in our town. It's time to send her back where she came from." His words echoed through the small wooden building, and for a moment there was a dead silence. Sheriff Walker shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but he said nothing. He knew better than to get involved in local politics. The town had been divided on the issue of Taya for weeks now, and everyone had their own opinion. Some people feared her, while others had started to admire her for the way she cared for the land and its people. But now, with Ralph Turner leading the charge, the whispers had turned to shouts. The plan was simple. Drive her out of town before things got any worse. It wasn't the first time someone had been run out of Red Mesa. Out here, people either fit in or they left. There was no room for outsiders who didn't know how to survive. But just as the meeting was about to adjourn, the door creaked open, and a man stepped into the room. He wasn't from Red Mesa, that was clear. His boots were dusted with desert sand, and his hat was pulled low over his eyes. His rugged face showed the signs of a life lived on the move, and his eyes were sharp like a hawk watching over its prey. This was a man who knew how to survive. The room fell silent as he walked in, his spurs clinking with each step. The man stopped at the front of the room and turned to face the crowd. He wasn't tall, but there was something about him that made people pay attention. He wasn't just a cowboy, he was a force of nature, as much a part of the desert as the red rock and the endless sky. "I heard what you're planning," he said, his voice low and steady. "And I'll tell you right now, you're making a mistake." Ralph Turner, never one to back down from a challenge, scowled. "And who are you to tell us what to do, stranger?" The man didn't flinch. "I'm the one who's telling you that if you throw her out, you'll have to answer to me." There was a murmur of disbelief from the crowd. A few people exchanged uneasy glances. But Sheriff Walker, who had been watching the newcomer closely, recognized the determination in the man's eyes. This wasn't someone who was going to back down. "You're not from here," Ralph said, his voice growing more hostile. "This isn't your fight." The man's lips curled into a faint smile. "I'm making it my fight." For a long moment the room was still, the tension so thick that it was almost suffocating. The townspeople knew what was at stake. If they followed through with their plan to drive Taya out, it would mean a showdown. And this cowboy wasn't the kind of man who made empty threats. He was the kind of man who stood his ground. The sheriff sighed and stood up. This town doesn't need any more bloodshed. We've had enough of that. But the cowboy, still standing tall, didn't take his eyes off Ralph. Then tell your people to leave her be. She's not the problem here. The problem is your fear. Ralph turned to his supporters, his face flushed with anger. You heard him. We're doing this for the good of the town. But as he spoke, a small voice rose from the back of the room. It was quiet at first, barely a whisper, but it carried weight. Maybe he's right. Maybe we're wrong to treat her like this. It was Susan Bennett, a woman who had lost her husband to the desert years ago. She had seen the changes in the land and in the people. Susan had seen Taya's kindness, the way she helped the children when they were sick, the way she'd saved that young man from a rattlesnake bite last week. Taya hadn't asked for anything in return. But in a town like Red Mesa, trust didn't come easily. Ralph slammed his fist on the table. Enough of this. We're running her out of here, and that's final. The cowboy took a step forward. Not while I'm here. The next morning, the sun hung low over the red desert, casting long shadows over Red Mesa. The townspeople gathered in the center of town, just like they had the day before, but this time there was an edge to the air. Word had spread quickly about the cowboy's challenge. Most of the townsfolk were still uneasy, unsure of what to make of the stranger who had walked into their lives and demanded so much. The people were a mix of settlers, traders, and those just passing through, and they were all wondering the same thing. Who was this man, and why had he chosen this moment to show up? Taya stood in the doorway of her small hut on the edge of town, looking out at the people assembling in the square.
She had heard the whispers, felt the tension in the air.
Her people had always been proud, strong, but they had never been accepted by outsiders, especially not in a town like Red Mesa. She had expected trouble when she had arrived. She had always expected trouble. It was the way of her people, always fighting to hold on to what was theirs, always trying to survive in a world that didn't understand them. But now something had changed. She had expected to be driven out. She had even prepared herself for it, but the cowboy's words still echoed in her mind. Whoever throws her out answers to me, the crowd murmured as Sheriff Walker stepped forward, trying to regain some control of the situation. He wasn't happy about this. It wasn't the way he usually dealt with problems, but it seemed like his hands were tied. The people of Red Mesa had made up their minds. They wanted Taya gone. They wanted to return to the peace they once had. But now, this cowboy had thrown down the gauntlet, and there was no way to ignore it. "Everyone, settle down!" the sheriff called, his voice cutting through the crowd. "This isn't the way we handle things here." But the cowboy stood tall, his eyes locked on Ralph Turner, who was standing at the front, his face red with anger. It was clear that Ralph wasn't going to back down. He was used to getting his way in Red Mesa, and he didn't like being challenged. "This town has rules," Ralph said, stepping forward. "And we've all agreed that the Apache woman doesn't belong here. So you can leave, stranger."
"We don't want any trouble."
The cowboy didn't flinch. He stood firm, his stance wide, as if he had already made up his mind. "You don't want trouble?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made everyone stop and listen. "Then stop making threats. I don't want trouble either, but I'll stand for what's right." They had seen the cowboy around town before. He didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened. There was something about him, something that told them he wasn't a man to be taken lightly. Ralph narrowed his eyes. "You think you can stand up to us? The whole town? For one woman?" The cowboy met his gaze, unwavering. "I'm not standing up for just one woman. I'm standing up for what's fair. You want to drive her out, you'll have to deal with me." The crowd fell silent. Taya could feel the weight of the moment, the eyes of the entire town on her. She wasn't sure what to think. This cowboy, this stranger, had thrown everything into question. She had expected to be rejected, but now she wasn't so sure. Ralph scoffed. "You think the whole town is just going to roll over because you say so? We've all had enough of this." "I didn't ask for your approval," the cowboy replied, "but I'll say it again. Whoever touches her answers to me." Taya felt a strange warmth in her chest. She had never been given this kind of attention before, this kind of protection. She had always been on her own, depending on no one. But something about this cowboy's words made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Ralph's hands balled into fists. "You're making a mistake, stranger. You don't know what you're up against." "Maybe I don't," the cowboy said, his voice steady, "but I'm willing to find out." There was a long pause, and for a moment it seemed like everyone was holding their breath. The sun was high in the sky now, beating down on the crowd, and the heat seemed to make the air thick and heavy. Finally, Sheriff Walker stepped in, his voice firm. "Enough. This isn't the time for fighting. The people of this town have made up their minds, and we've already had enough bloodshed in these parts. Let's not make things worse." The cowboy turned to the sheriff, his eyes hard. "You might be the sheriff, but that doesn't make you the law here. The people might follow you, but they still have to answer to their own conscience. You want to drive her out? You'll have to do it over my dead body." Ralph looked around at the crowd, searching for support, but it seemed like there was a shift in the air. A few people were starting to look uncomfortable, their eyes shifting away from the confrontation. Some had begun to doubt whether driving Taya out was the right thing to do. They didn't like being pushed into a corner. "We don't have to do this," the sheriff said, his voice softer now. "No one wants a fight. We can find a way to move forward without bloodshed." But Ralph wasn't about to back down. "This is the only way to keep the peace." The cowboy shook his head. "Peace built on fear isn't peace. It's just waiting for the next fight."
Aya stepped forward, her presence quiet but powerful.
"I never asked for your help," she said, her voice steady. "But I'm not leaving. I have nowhere to go." The crowd went silent again, all eyes on her. Some of them still didn't understand. But others saw the truth in her words. She wasn't asking for a fight. She was asking for acceptance. For a moment it felt like the entire town was on the edge of something important. Would they continue down this path of fear and division? Or would they find a way to live together, to accept each other for who they truly were? Ralph turned to face the cowboy, his face tight with anger. "You'll regret this, stranger." But the cowboy only smiled. "I've got no regrets. It's time to do what's right." And with that, the standoff was set. It wasn't just about one woman anymore. It was about the soul of the town and what kind of place Red Mesa would become. The day that followed was one of tension and uncertainty. Red Mesa streets, normally quiet under the harsh desert sun, felt alive with an energy that could barely be contained. Word had spread. The cowboy Zach had made his stand, and the townspeople were split. Some still sided with Ralph Turner, while others, uncertain of what to do, had begun to reconsider. Sheriff Walker, who had stayed out of the argument so far, felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had always believed in law and order, but this felt different. Was he supposed to enforce the will of the town, even if it meant chasing away an innocent woman who had done nothing but help? Or should he stand with Zach, the outsider who had spoken for Taya when no one else would? The sun hung high in the sky, beating down on the small desert town. Zach stood in the center of the street, arms crossed, his eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting trouble. Taya had retreated to the edge of town, staying out of sight, waiting for what was to come. She had never seen someone like Zach before, a man who wasn't afraid to face the crowd, who wasn't afraid to speak up when others were too scared. Zach had been quiet since the confrontation the day before. He hadn't needed to say much. His words had been clear enough. He was there to protect Taya, and nothing would change that. But now, with the tension building, it seemed that the time for words was running out. Ralph Turner, furious and frustrated, paced back and forth in front of the saloon. He had been trying to gather his supporters, but some were wavering. The people who had once cheered for driving Taya out of town now looked unsure. They saw something in Zach, something they couldn't ignore. And Taya, though still an outsider, had shown kindness and strength they hadn't expected. "You think he's going to back down?" one of Ralph's men asked, his voice low and uncertain. Ralph sneered. "He's just one man. He'll fold. He doesn't know what it's like to live here. This is our town, not some place where we let strangers come and take over." But even Ralph knew, deep down, that Zach wasn't the kind of man who just gave up. His words, his calm and steady resolve, had planted doubt in the hearts of the people. As the morning wore on, the town started to gather in the center, watching the showdown unfold. Tensions were high, but there was also a sense of anticipation. The people of Red Mesa were on edge, unsure of what would happen next. Would they drive Taya out, as they had planned? Or would Zach's courage inspire them to take a different path? In the saloon, Sheriff Walker stood with his back to the wall, his arms crossed, eyes locked on Zach. He wasn't sure where he stood anymore. He had sworn to uphold the law, but the law wasn't always about what was right. It was about what was convenient. And this time, nothing about it felt convenient. Ralph stormed into the saloon, a hard look on his face. He approached the sheriff, his voice low and angry. "You've got to do something about him," Ralph hissed. "He's making a mockery of this town." Sheriff Walker didn't respond right away. He looked at Ralph, his face unreadable. He knew what was coming next. Ralph was about to push him into making a decision, one that could either unite the town or tear it apart. "Do your job, Sheriff," Ralph growled, "before it's too late." But the sheriff wasn't so sure anymore. He had seen the way the townsfolk had looked at Taya, the way they had begun to question the very thing they had believed for so long. Maybe Ralph was right, but maybe, just maybe, Zack had a point too. Outside, the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the town. It was nearing high noon. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the weight of what was about to happen. Zack stepped into the center of the street, his boots crunching on the dirt. He wasn't a man who liked to fight, but he wasn't afraid of it either. He had faced worse odds in his life, and this wouldn't be any different. From a distance, Taya watched from the window of the old general store. She could see Zack standing there, tall and firm, like a rock in the middle of the storm. Her heart fluttered in her chest. She didn't know what to think, what to believe, but there was something in his presence that gave her hope. Hope that maybe she didn't have to face the world alone after all. A few of the townsfolk came out to watch. Some from curiosity, others from fear. It was clear they weren't sure what was going to happen next. But in that moment, Zack stood alone against the whole town, a single man who had refused to back down. Suddenly the sound of horses' hooves echoed through the dusty streets. Ralph had arrived, his supporters behind him. The crowd parted, and Ralph rode up to face Zack, his face twisted in anger. "This is your last chance, cowboy," Ralph shouted. "Leave now or we'll make you leave." Zack didn't flinch. His gaze never left Ralph's, and the fire in his eyes was unmistakable. "I'm not leaving." And neither is she. Ralph's grip tightened on the reins of his horse, his knuckles white. "You're making a mistake. We don't take kindly to people like her. And if you're with her, then you're part of the problem, too."
Zack's voice was low, steady. "You're wrong, Ralph."
"The problem is that you're afraid. Afraid of change, afraid of what you don't understand. But it's not too late to do the right thing." Ralph's eyes burned with rage. He didn't like being challenged. Didn't like someone standing up to him. He was used to getting his way. But now, standing in front of Zack, he realized something. This wasn't a fight he could win with threats. Zack wasn't afraid of him. And that, more than anything, made him dangerous. "You'll regret this," Ralph spat. But the words didn't hold the same power they once did. He could see the doubt in the eyes of his supporters, could feel the shift in the air. It was no longer just about Taya. It was about the town, about what kind of place Red Mesa would be. Without another word, Ralph turned his horse around and rode back toward the saloon. His supporters followed him, but the murmurs in the crowd grew louder. They had seen something today. They had seen a man stand up for what was right, even when the odds were against him. Zack stood in the middle of the street, his shoulders squared, waiting for the storm to pass. He didn't need to fight. His words had already won the battle. The people of Red Mesa had seen the truth, even if they didn't want to admit it. And for the first time, Taya felt a sense of peace. She wasn't alone anymore. The day after the standoff, the town of Red Mesa was quieter than it had been in days. The street that had once been filled with heated arguments and tense glares now felt strangely calm. It was as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to change. But no one knew what that change would look like. Zack stood on the outskirts of town, just beyond the main street. The dust of the desert seemed to swirl around him, mirroring the storm of thoughts in his mind. His stance was firm, his hands resting on the saddle of his horse. He had never been one for speeches or trying to convince others to see things his way, but something about the people of Red Mesa had stirred a sense of duty within him. He didn't know what was next for him or Taya, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to leave her behind. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It had been a long day of silence and reflection. No one had come to confront him or Taya, and that in itself was a victory. The threat of violence had been averted, but there was still work to be done. There were still people in the town who needed to be convinced, and that was where the real battle lay. Taya had stayed in her hut, watching the quiet from the safety of her home. She had been unsure of what to make of the whole situation, uncertain of how to feel about Zack and his protection. She had never known kindness like his. Her people had fought for their survival for generations, and trust was something that had to be earned, not freely given. But over the past few days, she had seen something in Zack, something that made her believe he wasn't like the others. Slowly, she walked to the door of her hut and stepped outside, the evening breeze brushing against her face. Her gaze drifted across the town. It was hard to believe that just days ago she had been the target of their fear and suspicion. But now, things were different. Zack had stood up for her, and in doing so, he had done something more powerful than anything she could have imagined. He had shown them that standing together was stronger than fear. The townspeople had been wary of Taya for so long, but Zack's actions had made them question everything. They were no longer sure who the enemy was. Was it Taya, who had done nothing but live in peace, or was it the fear that had controlled them for so long? There was still much work to be done, but for the first time, Taya felt like she might have a place in this world. As the evening wore on, Zack walked toward the center of town. He knew the people would have questions. He didn't expect them to all welcome him with open arms, but he was ready to face whatever came next. His boots echoed softly in the quiet street as he approached the saloon, where many of the townspeople had gathered to discuss the events of the past few days. Ralph Turner was there, standing near the door, his arms crossed. The angry fire that had burned in his eyes the day before seemed to have dimmed, but there was still a coldness in his stare. Zack could see that Ralph hadn't fully accepted what had happened, but he also saw something else. An uncertainty. Ralph had always prided himself on being the man who called the shots in Red Mesa, but now things were different. There was a crack in his armor. Zack didn't waste any time. He walked straight up to Ralph, his face calm but firm. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but clear. Ralph didn't respond at first. He just stood there, his jaw clenched, staring at Zack. For a moment it felt like the air itself had thickened, like the town was holding its breath again. "I know you're angry," Zack continued, his voice steady. "But I'm not the enemy here. Neither is Taya." Ralph's eyes narrowed. "I don't know if I believe that. You don't just come into a town and change everything. There are rules. We've lived here long enough to know how things work." Zack nodded slowly. "I get that. But those rules haven't worked for everyone. You know as well as I do that fear has kept this town from growing, from accepting what's different." Ralph turned his head, looking away for a moment. "You think you know everything about this town, don't you?" "I don't know everything," Zack said, taking a step closer. "But I do know what's right. And I know what's wrong. This town doesn't have to stay divided. You can choose a different way. It doesn't have to be like this." Ralph's expression softened for a brief moment, but his pride quickly took over. He straightened up, his shoulders rigid. "You're asking me to just forget everything that's happened? To trust a woman we don't know? A woman who could bring danger to all of us?" Zack's eyes locked onto his, unwavering. "No. I'm asking you to give her a chance. I'm asking you to stop letting fear control you. It's not just about her. It's about all of us, working together, learning to accept each other. If we don't, then we'll keep living in the same cycle. We'll always be afraid of what we don't understand." Ralph stood there for a moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "Maybe you're right. Maybe we've been too quick to judge. But it's not easy, Zack. It's not easy to change what's been in place for so long." Zack nodded. "I know. But nothing worth doing ever is. And if this town is going to survive, it has to change. It has to be better than it is now." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. Ralph's shoulders relaxed slightly, and for the first time in a long while he seemed unsure of himself. The ground beneath them had shifted, and Ralph felt it. The walls he had built to protect the town, to protect his own sense of power, were starting to crack. "I'll think about it," Ralph said, his voice softer now, almost reluctant. Zack nodded. "That's all I ask." As the conversation came to a close, Zack turned and walked away, heading back toward the edge of town where Taya waited. There was no final victory in the words they had exchanged, but there had been a shift. Ralph had heard him, and that was a start. Later that night, as the stars began to twinkle above the desert, Taya stood at the edge of her hut watching the night sky. Zack walked over and stood beside her, his presence a comforting weight. "It's not over," she said quietly, her voice soft but filled with determination. "No," Zack agreed, "but we've made a start. And that's all we can do." Together they stood in silence, watching the desert night unfold around them. The future of Red Mesa was uncertain, but for the first time, there was hope. They had faced fear, they had faced prejudice, and they had chosen a different path. What came next was still unclear, but as long as they stood together, they would face it as allies, as partners, ready to fight for the future they believed in. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.